Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Museum Munchkins. I'm Mr. Nick, and today we are going to be talking all about whooping cranes. And we're going to start off by singing a whooping crane song if you want to stand up on your feet. Now, in this song, we're going to be actually learning how to do a dance that the whooping cranes do. And we're going to add a little piece bit by bit as we sing the song. With every verse, we'll add a new part of the dance. So we'll listen for the different parts of the dance and follow along. Are you ready? All right, here we go. There was a crane in a marshy pond, the prettiest crane that you ever did see. Well, they're crane in the pond. So can we stand in a pond? And the cranes, they danced all around and around, and the cranes, they danced all around. All right, so first we're standing in a pond. Are you ready? There was a crane in a marshy pond, the prettiest crane that you ever did see. Well, they flapped their wings, the crane in the pond, and the cranes, they danced all around and around, and the cranes, they danced all around. Very good. So we flap our wings first. What do you think comes next? There was a crane in a marshy pond, the prettiest crane that you ever did see. Well, they bobbed their head. Can you bob your head up and down? And they flapped their wings, the crane in the pond, and the cranes, they danced all around and around, and the cranes, they danced all around. There was a crane in a marshy pond, the prettiest crane that you ever did see. Well, they jump up and down. Can you jump up and down? Jump up and down and bob their head and flap their wings, the crane in the pond, and the cranes, they danced all around and around, and the cranes, they danced all around. Ooh, there's a lot of steps to this dance. There was a crane in a marshy pond, the prettiest crane that you ever did see. Well, they threw some grass and jumped up and down and bobbed their head and flapped their wings, the crane in the pond, and the cranes, they danced all around and around, and the cranes, they danced all around. There was a crane in a marshy pond, the prettiest crane that you ever did see. Well, they sing curlew and throw some grass and jump up and down and bob their head and flap their wings, a crane in the pond, and the cranes, they dance all around and around, and the cranes, they danced all around. Very good. Thank you so much for learning that song with me and learning all about how the dances that whooping cranes do. I'm going to set my guitar down so we can talk even more about whooping cranes. Let's set that down, and I'll move my desk a little bit forward so we can talk all about whooping cranes. Now, have you ever seen a whooping crane before? Maybe you have if you've been really lucky. So whooping cranes are actually one of the largest types of birds that we find here in North America. They're actually the tallest bird that we find here in North America. There are some that are long, have wider wings or are heavier, but they're actually the tallest bird that we find here in North America. Where we live here in Kenosha, Kenosha is in North America too. And they stand between 4 and 5 feet tall. And their wingspan, that means if they spread their wings out like this, their wingspan can be between 6.5 and 7 feet wide, which is really big. But even though they're such big birds, they don't weigh very much at all. They only weigh about 15 pounds. And that's because of their hollow bones that help them to fly around and lighten them so they can soar on those big, giant wings through the air. Like I said, they live here in North America, and we find whooping cranes all kind of throughout it, but mostly up here in northern Canada, in Alberta. We find them here in Wisconsin, and they fly every year from up in Alberta down to Texas, or from Wisconsin down to Florida. So we find them in those states too. Now, whooping cranes are actually an endangered species. Have you ever heard that word before? Endangered? That just means that there aren't very many of these animals left out in the wild. In fact, there's only about 800 whooping cranes left in the wild today, but there are actually a lot of people who are working to help make sure that the whooping crane populations go back up and we actually get more whooping cranes out in the wild. There's lots of scientists who are working to help the whooping cranes like that. And whooping cranes are tall and their bodies are covered in white feathers. So they have white feathers all over their bodies. On the tips of their wings, they have black feathers, and they have a big red piece of skin on the top of their head. So they're pretty easy to recognize, especially since they're so tall. So these big, tall birds covered in white feathers with black tips to their wings and a bright red spot on the top of their heads. And they have a long, pointy beak, and they use that for gobbling up all of the food that they like to eat. So whooping cranes live in marshy areas or wetlands, places where there's a lot of water covering the ground, but grasses and plants and other things growing up through the water too. That's where they like to live and where they like to hunt for their food. And they are omnivores. Can you say that word with me? Omnivore. So an omnivore is an animal that eats plants and other animals. So whooping cranes will eat plants, like some of the different plants that grow in the water around where they like to live, those aquatic plants. But they'll also eat a lot of the animals, the smaller animals that live there too. Things like blue crabs and crayfish and snails and little fish and little eels, frogs, things like that. So any little thing that's really small like that they can catch in their beak, they'll eat those too. Now, whooping cranes, like I said, some of them live way up north in Canada and fly down to Texas every year and then back up. And some live in Wisconsin and fly down to Florida every year and then back up. And when they do that, that's called migrating. So they migrate between the north and south where it's warmer. So they migrate up north in the warmer summer months. And then when it gets too cold, they fly back down south where it's warmer for them. So they like to stay kind of warm all year long. So they have to migrate to warmer weather like that. So migrating, that's when they fly back and forth like that. And actually, the group that lives here in Wisconsin is actually a pretty new group. So back in 2010, so only about 11 years ago, in the Nesita National Wildlife Refuge in sort of central Wisconsin, the whooping cranes actually started nesting there for the first time in 100 years, which is pretty exciting. So that group that lives there is actually a pretty new group that flies back down south to Florida every year. Now, like we learned in our song today, whooping cranes love to do a little dance to attract other whooping cranes to them. And it's actually a pretty fun dance to do. So when they do their dance, they make that sound, that curlew sound. So they kind of like that, but it has kind of like scientists say it sounds like a sound. Can you try doing that with me? And then a loo. Can you try doing the loo part? So they go curlew. Very good. So they make that curlew noise and they flap their wings. They don't flap them really fast. They sort of flap them really slow like this. And they jump up and down on their feet. and they bob their heads up and down like that. And they'll throw grass or feathers that are around them. They'll kick those up into the air too, which is pretty interesting. It's a pretty fun dance to do. Maybe you will. I liked learning how to do that dance in our song today. That flapping our wings and hopping around and bobbing our heads up and down. They're pretty interesting birds to watch. And actually, today we have a story about a whooping crane and some people who liked doing that whooping crane dance too. Whooping crane, though, in our story today is named Tex. And one of the cool things about our story today